On July 20, 1969, well, it was a truly monumental chapter in human history. Apollo 11's lunar module, the Eagle, it touched down, tranquilitatis on the moon. And then just hours later, Neil Armstrong, the mission commander, said those words we all know. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I mean, what a moment. It was this incredible technological marvel, really, the result of, hundreds of thousands of people working tirelessly and just a shining symbol of, human potential. Ingenuity. But even with all that global celebration, this achievement, a strange kind of doubt started to creep in. We're talking about the moon landing conspiracy theories, the idea that NASA, maybe the whole U.S. government, actually staged the entire thing, a massive hoax. And these ideas, they've somehow stuck around for, over half a century now. You see them in books, documentaries, and, all over the internet, obviously.
And that's exactly what we want to tackle in this deep dive. We're going to conduct a really thorough investigation. We'll systematically answer that big question, did humans really land on the moon? We'll do it by carefully separating the historical facts from, the fiction that spreads so widely. And we'll use empirical evidence. It's quite a paradox when you think about it, isn't it? Apollo was, one of the most publicly documented, openly watched projects ever. Millions saw it live. Yet it's become this magnet for claims of, deep, dark secrets. So this deep dive, it's not just about what happened. It's also about trying to understand why some people choose to believe it didn't.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because, when we think about going to the moon, it's easy to picture this purely scientific dream, a romantic vision. But the Apollo program, its origins were much more tangled than that. It wasn't born out of that kind of vision. It was really a direct response to these incredibly intense geopolitical pressures.
Ideological pressures, too.
The Cold War. So this journey to the moon, it was way more than science. It was a really high-stakes game. Prestige, power, everything was on the line.
Absolutely. The space race just perfectly symbolized that whole Cold War rivalry, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. And the thing that really lit the fire, the event that truly shocked America, was the Soviet launch of Sputnik 1, October 4, 1957. That changed everything. And the Soviets just kept racking up first, didn't they? First animal in space, first human, Yuri Gagarin, first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. Each one just added more and more pressure on the U.S. to, catch up and pull ahead.
Right. And amidst all that, those feelings of falling behind, the Cold War tension just ratcheting up, President John F. Kennedy steps up. May 25, 1961, that historic speech to Congress, declaring this, frankly, unbelievably ambitious goal. Send a man to the moon and return him safely before this decade is out. Yeah. It wasn't just, a scientific target. It was clear, measurable. It was basically throwing down the gauntlet in the space race, staking America's reputation on it.
And achieving that? Well, it came at a huge cost, a human cost, too. We absolutely have to remember the Apollo 1 fire. January 27, 1967. 3 astronauts died. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. During a ground test. It was a terrible tragedy, and it really drives home the real dangers involved. It completely undermines any idea that you could just, fake something this complex easily without real risk. That disaster actually led to major safety redesigns, making the whole program safer. And the budget, around $30 billion back then. Huge money. Some people point to that as a motive for a hoax, like follow the money. But really, it just reflected the immense scale and complexity, funding all the R&D, the new tech, and employing, as you said, hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, the scale's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Just trying to picture the operation itself. You have the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful rocket ever built, over 110 meters tall, designed to launch these enormous payloads all the way to the moon. And then the coordination needed between the command module, Columbia, and the lunar module, the Eagle, it's mind-bendingly complex.
It really is. And how did they even get to the point of building a Saturn V? That didn't happen overnight. You had the earlier programs, Project Mercury, Project Gemini. They were essential stepping stones. They developed all the critical stuff, flying humans in orbit, working in space for longer periods, figuring out how to rendezvous and dock spacecraft. You couldn't do Apollo without that groundwork. And crucially, back to the people, over 400,000 individuals involved. NASA, contractors, universities. Now think about keeping a conspiracy secret among that many people. For decades, it's just, it beggars belief, frankly. The logistics of a cover-up that vast are almost more incredible than the landing itself.
So what does all this context tell us, especially the Cold War part? It seems to suggest the U.S. absolutely had to succeed for real, authentically. The Soviets were right there, weren't they? Trying to get to the moon themselves, watching Apollo like hawks with their own tracking systems they would have known. Thinking it would have been a disaster if they got caught. A massive propaganda defeat. Way worse than just losing the race fair and square.
Exactly. The political pressure demanded real success. Failure was bad, But a discovered hoax would have been catastrophic on a global scale. The incentive was overwhelmingly towards actually doing it.
Okay, so now let's shift gears and look directly at the things conspiracy theories focus on. The so-called anomalies in the photos, the videos, the claims that it was all just impossible anyway. We're going to act as fact checkers here. But maybe before we debunk specific points, why do these ideas even take hold? What makes them so persistent?
That's a really important question. I think part of it is just human nature. We often look for simple explanations for really big, complex, maybe even slightly scary events like landing on the moon. And there's often a baseline distrust of, big government, large institutions. Conspiracy theories offer this alternative story. It makes people feel like they're in the know, that they see a hidden truth. Sometimes, honestly, it might feel more comforting or exciting to believe in a huge cover-up than in a difficult, expensive, sometimes messy reality. Plus, you have things like confirmation bias people look for evidence that fits what they already suspect.
That makes sense. Okay, so bearing that psychology in mind, let's tackle one of the classics, the waving flag. You see the pictures, and it really does look like it's fluttering. What's the real story?
Right, this one comes up constantly. The key thing is that wasn't just a regular flag on a pole. It was a specially designed kit, the Lunar Flag Assembly, or LFA. It had a horizontal telescopic pole along the top edge, meant to make the flag hang straight and look, well, good in the vacuum of space where there's no wind to unfurl it. But on Apollo 11, the astronauts couldn't fully extend that horizontal pole. It got stuck partway, so the nylon fabric bunched up and got wrinkled. That's what gives it that rippling, waving appearance in still photos. And if you see it seeming to move in the video footage, that's just the astronauts twisting and jiggling the main flagpole as they planted it in lunar soil. That motion transferred momentum to the flag assembly. In a vacuum, with no air resistance, it would swing back and forth for a bit due to inertia, like a stiff pendulum, before settling down. No wind required.
Okay, that makes sense. How about the next big one? The starless sky. Feels weird, right? You're on the moon, looking out into deep space. Didn't you see billions of stars? Why are the photos black?
Yeah, this trips a lot of people up, but it's actually down to basic photography. Think about how bright it is on the moon during the day. You've got direct, unfiltered sunlight hitting the surface, no atmosphere to scatter it. And those white spacesuits, incredibly reflective. So to take a properly exposed picture of the astronauts in the lunar landscape, the cameras had to use very fast shutter speeds, maybe 125th or 12/50th of a second, and small apertures, meaning not much light getting in. Stars are incredibly faint compared to that brightly lit foreground. Their light simply wasn't strong enough to register on the film during such a short exposure time. It's exactly like trying to take a picture of stars during the daytime here on Earth. The sky's too bright. The dark, starless sky in the Apollo photos. That's precisely what you'd expect based on photographic principles.
Right, okay. Photography limits. But what about the shadows? Some photos show shadows that aren't parallel, which leads people to say, aha, multiple light sources, like studio lights. What's going on there?
That's another good one that seems suspicious at first glance. But the explanation involves a few things coming together. First, the moon's surface isn't a perfectly flat studio floor. It's uneven. You've got craters, little hills, rocks, undulating ground. Shadows falling across this bumpy terrain won't look parallel. Their direction and length will change depending on the slope they fall on. Second, perspective. The astronauts used wide-angle lenses quite a bit. Wide-angle lenses can make parallel lines appear to converge or diverge in a photograph, especially if they're receding into the distance. It's a standard optical effect. And third, while the sun is obviously the main super bright light source, it's not technically the only source of light. You get sunlight bouncing off the bright lunar dust, the regolith. You get light reflected from the Earthshine, which looks huge and bright in the lunar sky. You even get light bouncing off one astronaut's white suit onto another nearby. These act like natural fill lights, softening the shadows slightly and making them less harsh than you might expect in a pure vacuum. None of this requires studio lighting. It's just the physics of light on the moon.
Okay, and there are some other, maybe more minor photo claims, like seeing the camera crosshairs behind objects sometimes, or just the photos seeming too perfect.
Right, the crosshairs or reticles. Those were actually etched onto a glass plate inside the camera body, between the lens and the film. If a very bright object, like the white part of a spacesuit in direct sun, was in the frame, it could be so bright that it completely overexposed that tiny area of the film emulsion. This overexposure could essentially blow out the image of the thin black crosshair line in that spot, making it look like the object is in front of the crosshairs. It's an artifact of intense brightness on film. As for the photos being too good, Well, remember, NASA released the best shots. They took thousands of pictures across the missions. Many were blurry, poorly composed, or badly exposed. We just see the highlights. And they were using top-of-the-line equipment for the time, Hasselblad cameras with high-quality Zeiss lenses. These were designed to produce sharp, detailed images. So, yes, the good photos are very good, but that's not suspicious. It's expected.
So these photographic anomalies, they all seem to have pretty solid scientific explanations based on the environment and the equipment.
Pretty much. They aren't really anomalies at all when you understand the conditions.
Okay, let's move beyond the photos then. Some theories claim the journey itself was impossible, that the space environment, particularly radiation, was just too deadly for 1960s tech. The Van Allen belts always come up here.
Ah, yes, the Van Allen radiation belts. This is a classic claim, but it really overstates the danger and misunderstands how the missions were planned. NASA knew all about the belts, obviously. They had been discovered years earlier by probes. There's an inner belt and an outer belt, regions of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. So they planned the Apollo trajectories very, very carefully. They didn't just fly straight through the most intense parts. They flew through them at extremely high speed, minimizing the time spent inside. And they generally flew on paths that took them through the thinner, less intense regions, often going over the poles where the radiation levels are significantly lower. The total time spent in the most hazardous zones was actually quite short, maybe 15 to 30 minutes in total for the passage through both belts. Plus, the command module itself, the spacecraft the astronauts were inside, provided shielding. Its aluminum hull was quite effective at blocking most of the radiation particles. Instruments carried by the astronauts actually measured the dose they received. It was low, around 0.15 REDs, which is well below the levels considered dangerous. It was a known engineering challenge, and they engineered a solution, not an insurmountable barrier.
Okay, that addresses the radiation concern. But let's say someone is still skeptical. Maybe they think, okay, fine, NASA faked the photos and the radiation data. Is there proof that comes from completely outside NASA, independent evidence that can't be easily dismissed?
Absolutely, and this is where the case becomes really compelling, moving beyond just refuting claims to providing positive, verifiable proof. Let's start with the Lunar Laser Ranging Experiment, or LRR. This is fascinating. On Apollo 11, 14, and 15, the astronauts placed special arrays of mirrors on the moon's surface. These aren't just any mirrors, they're corner cube retroreflectors. Basically, they're designed to reflect any laser beam fired at them directly back to its point of origin with incredible precision.
And the amazing part is, observatories here on Earth have been doing just that for over 50 years now, right? Firing lasers at these specific spots on the moon and getting the signal back.
Exactly. Observatories all over the world, in the US, France, Germany, other places, participate in this. It's an ongoing international scientific effort. By precisely timing how long it takes for the laser pulse to travel to the moon and back, they can measure the Earth-Moon distance with millimeter accuracy. The fact that these human-made devices are still there, still working at the exact Apollo landing sites, is undeniable physical evidence that someone put them there. There's just no other plausible explanation for how they got there. And these experiments aren't just proof of the landings, they've yielded important science, like confirming the moon is slowly drifting away from Earth, about 3.8 centimeters per year, and even helping determine its core is likely liquid.
That's really powerful. Physical objects left behind, used by scientists globally. But that's still kind of indirect proof, measuring reflections. Is there direct visual confirmation? Can we actually see the landing sites?
We can now, yes. Thanks to NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, which launched in 2009. LRO has been mapping the moon in incredibly high resolution. Its cameras are sharp enough to actually photograph the Apollo landing sites from orbit, and the images are clear. You can see the descent stages of the lunar modules, the part they left behind. You can see the scientific instruments the astronauts set up, the ALSEP packages. For the later missions, Apollo 15, 16, 17, you can even see the tracks left by the lunar roving vehicles, the moon buggies, and faint paths where the astronauts walked between the lander and their experiments. And crucially, it's not just NASA confirming this. Lunar orbiters from other countries, Japan's Kaguya, India's Chandrayaan, China's Chang'e probes, have also imaged these sites and confirmed the presence of these Apollo artifacts. It's like sending multiple independent witnesses back to the scene.
Wow, okay. Tracks, lander bases, equipment, all seen by multiple countries' spacecraft. It's hard to argue with. But maybe the most tangible proof, the stuff they brought back, the moon rocks.
The lunar samples, yes. Over the 6 landing missions, the Apollo astronauts brought back 382 kilograms. That's about 842 pounds of moon rocks, core samples, dust, and soil. And these samples are unique. They're completely different from rocks found anywhere on Earth. They contain essentially 0 water, trapped in their mineral structures. They show no signs of erosion by wind or water because, well, the moon has no atmosphere or liquid water. They're covered in tiny zap pits from micrometeoroid impacts over billions of years. And they have unique isotopic signatures, basically, specific ratios of atomic variance caused by long-term exposure to cosmic rays in the solar wind, unshielded by an atmosphere or magnetic field. But here's the most critical point. NASA didn't hoard these rocks. They distributed samples to hundreds, literally hundreds, of qualified scientists and research institutions all around the globe for decades. This included sending samples to scientists in the Soviet Union, America's Cold War rival, and in over 50 years of intense study by thousands of independent geologists and planetary scientists worldwide, not a single one has ever questioned their extraterrestrial origin. They are undeniably from the moon. So to believe the landings were faked, you have to believe that all these thousands of international scientists, including Soviet ones, are all in on this massive conspiracy spanning decades with not one leak, not one whistleblower. That stretches credulity way past the breaking point.
That's an incredibly powerful point. The global scientific consensus based on physical samples. Okay, let's consider one more angle, perhaps the most compelling political evidence. It comes not from the U.S., but from their biggest rival at the time, the Soviet Union. If Apollo was a hoax, the Soviets had the most to gain by exposing it. They had the technical means to track the missions, didn't they? And certainly the motivation. So why did they shout fake for the rooftops?
That's exactly right. The Soviets were absolutely not passive observers. They had a very sophisticated space program themselves, extensive intelligence networks, and global tracking stations. They monitored every single phase of the Apollo missions. They listened to the communications between the spacecraft and Earth. They tracked the spacecraft's trajectories. In fact, during the Apollo 11 mission itself, the Soviets had their own unmanned probe, Luna 15, orbiting the moon at the same time. It was trying to swoop down, grab a soil sample, and race back to Earth before Apollo 11 returned. It actually crashed, unfortunately for them, but this just shows how closely they were watching and how capable they were of detecting any inconsistencies, any sign of fakery. They were right there.
So given they were watching so closely and had every reason to want to discredit the U.S., what was their official reaction when Apollo 11 landed?
It was, well, remarkably subdued regarding any hint of fraud. There was a striking silence on hoax claims from official Soviet sources. Instead, their state-controlled media, like the newspapers Pravda and Izvestia, they reported the Apollo 11 landing as a factual event. It certainly downplayed the American triumph, emphasizing the risks and costs, but they reported it as having happened. The Soviet premier at the time, Alexei Kosygin, even sent official congratulations to the United States. And many Soviet cosmonauts and space scientists publicly acknowledged the American achievement, praising their bravery and technical skill. This silence of the adversary, especially an adversary with the means and motive to expose a fake, is incredibly strong evidence for the mission's authenticity. A hoax would have been the ultimate propaganda coup for them. They didn't take it because there was no hoax to expose.
And the irony here is just fascinating. Because the Soviets were engaged in a space race deception, not the one conspiracy theorists imagine.
Exactly. After they clearly lost the race to the moon, the Soviet government publicly claimed they had never really been serious about sending humans there. They said their focus was always on robotic exploration, which was safer and more scientific. That was a complete fabrication. We now know, largely after the collapse of the Soviet Union revealed archives, that they had a massive, secret, parallel human lunar program. It was centered around their own giant moon rocket, the N1, but the N1 was a disaster. All 4 of its unmanned test launches between 1969 and 1972 ended in catastrophic explosions. So they covered up their failure by pretending they never really tried. This just underscores how intensely real that competition was for them and how devastating the defeat felt.
And all this leads to a moment that really kind of seals the deal, doesn't it? A moment of cooperation that wouldn't make sense if the Soviets thought Apollo was fake.
Precisely. We're talking about the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. This was the symbolic end of the space race. A U.S. Apollo spacecraft docked in Earth orbit with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft. American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts met, shook hands, conducted joint experiments. Think about the level of technical cooperation, data sharing, and mutual trust required for that mission. It would be utterly inconceivable for the Soviets to engage in that kind of partnership if they secretly believed the entire Apollo program, the foundation of NASA's human spaceflight capability at that point, was a giant lie. Apollo-Soyuz was an implicit, unconditional acknowledgement of the reality and legitimacy of the American space program, including the moon landings. It's a curious modern twist, though, that despite this history, belief in the moon landing hoax is reportedly quite high in Russia today. It seems to be a kind of historical revisionism, perhaps more influenced by current geopolitics than the actual historical facts acknowledged at the time. So, summing it all up, the Apollo journey to the moon was undeniably one of humanity's greatest achievements. But somehow, it also spawned one of the most persistent modern myths. And while conspiracy theories can be seductive, they offer simple answers. Feed into distrust, a careful, critical look at the actual evidence reveals a clear picture. The Cold War context made a hoax politically untenable. The supposed anomalies in the photos and videos are all readily explained by basic physics, optics, and the lunar environment. And crucially, there's just overwhelming positive proof from independent international sources. Those laser reflectors still being pinged by global observatories, the landing sites imaged by multiple nations' orbiters, and those 382 kilograms of moon rocks studied and confirmed by scientists worldwide for half a century.
And maybe the loudest silence of all, the ultimate confirmation, came from the Soviet Union. The rivals who had every reason and the means to expose a fake, but instead acknowledged the reality, however grudgingly at first, and eventually even cooperated in space. So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening now? Why does debunking this conspiracy matter beyond just, correcting the historical record?
Well, I think it's about more than just history. It's about protecting a truly inspiring legacy. Apollo showed us what humans are capable of when we unite behind a huge, difficult goal. It pushed the boundaries of science and engineering. It's proof of concept for tackling massive challenges, something that feels pretty relevant today, doesn't it? It reminds us of our potential for collective achievement.
Yeah, absolutely. Neil Armstrong's one small step wasn't just a step onto the moon. It really does continue to symbolize that courage, that ingenuity, that